Hey everyone, Johnny Skywatcher here, bringing you another Should You Watch video. Tonight, we're covering The Midnight Gospel. The Midnight Gospel is a new adult animated series from Netflix. It was created by Pendleton Ward of Adventure Time and comedian Duncan Trussell. The story follows Clancy, a pink-skinned spacecaster, which is equivalent of a podcaster, as he uses what he calls a multiverse simulator to travel to new worlds and interview people for his spacecast, or podcast, obviously. I just want to start off by saying this is a weird show. It follows a podcast format because it is literally based off a podcast, which I didn't actually know before watching the show. But even like watching the first episode, you start thinking, what is this? This is not normal. And then I kind of was assuming that. And then I looked it up and I found out afterwards that it was based off the Duncan Trussell Family Hour, which was a real podcast. I think it started in 2013. I don't know if it's still going on or not, but it was a podcast, and they talked about a whole bunch of different things on it. And so what happens in each episode, Clancy basically follows someone on one of these worlds he travels to, and he interviews them for a space cast, and they just end up going through these increasingly weird and bizarre situations as they're just talking, and they'll talk about things like usually like the philosophy of death, or meditation, or something along those lines, something at least what seems deep. An example of how kind of weird this show can get is that in one of the early episodes, it's not episode 1, I think it's episode 2, Clancy goes to the planet, right? And then he runs into this, I guess, horse-like thing, and it has antlers, and he gets impaled by it. And then like it gets captured by these people, and they throw him in the back of the truck. And he starts talking to the horse thing, because of course it can talk, and so that's who he's interviewing for the whole time. And so then as they're interviewing, they get taken to this factory, and then they put on a conveyor belt, and they're going along, and they're talking, and then there's like this big meat grinder thing in front of them, and going smash, smash, and yeah, they just go through it. They get smashed. They're turned into like this burger-like, ground beef, and they're still talking, because like you see their eyes and their mouths, and they're still kind of like somehow sentient, even though they're just burger mush. And then they kind of get sent through, and then they get sent through like this. As the show goes on, they go through all these like tubes and everything. They go through not just the factory, it kind of goes all the way through the town. And yeah, that's most of what the episode is. So that's how weird it gets. Next, I want to try to cover what the trailer doesn't tell you about this show. So this, most importantly, this is not another Adventure Time. At least as so far as the kind of story structure Adventure Time is, this is not that. It has like the kind of animation, but it's a completely different kind of show. This is basically a podcast. They took a podcast, and then they made animation based on that. And then so you have this podcast running, and then just the animation that's inspired by. And then at the beginning and ending of each episode, there's like a bookmark, or kind of beginning and end cap to it, that has the sort of story elements to it. It's almost kind of like the beginning and ending scenes you had in Mystery Science Theater 3000. He starts off, he has some scenes, and then he decides which planet to go to, and then he goes to it, and then maybe have a little bit of stuff, and then like you get into like the interview part, and that's the part that it's very obviously different from the rest of the sort of storytelling, and that it's obvious that this sounds like it was taken from a podcast, like an interview. It doesn't sound like normal character dialogue. So if you were going into this show expecting a sort of another kind of show, just like Adventure Time, this is definitely not it. And I feel like even watching the trailer afterwards, I feel like the trailer does sell that somewhat, and that is not this show, and that's kind of misleading. Another question before watching the show you might be asking is, should I be worried about cancellation? This happens with a lot of shows, where you start watching it and then like you find out and after watching it that it didn't get renewed, or you get to season 2 and then it got canceled. Honestly, if you are the kind of person that likes this show, and I'll get more into that later on, but what exactly I mean with that, but I feel like if you're the kind of person who really likes this show, it doesn't really matter if it gets canceled, like at least in story-wise. You're not going to be upset about not knowing what happens next, because it's not that kind of show. The season does end on a note that I think could work, as like if you didn't get any more, that's okay, but it also easily works as a springboard for an ongoing storyline to go to new places. But I don't think it's necessary either way. I think if you could easily take it as just a limited series, and it would be fine. As you can probably tell from the way I'm talking about this show, I was not a huge fan of it, and I want to go a little bit into what I felt didn't really work about this show for me. So to start off, I watched the entire season. It was only 8 episodes long, so it wasn't really too hard to watch the whole thing. I think each episode was about 30 minutes long, I want to say. So it was like maybe 4 to 5 hours. I think the last episode was a little bit longer, but yeah, something like that. To start off, I'd say the thing that didn't work for me is that the conversation that's going on when he's interviewing people is only really somewhat related to what is happening in the animation. And what I found happening for me is that if I'm paying attention to the interview, to what they're saying, I'm kind of missing what's happening in the animation. And then the same thing for the other way around. If I'm paying attention to what's happening in the animation and watching what's going on, I kind of found myself just tuning out the podcast, because it's just them yammering on and on and on. And I kind of feel like that works for some things and like limited time, but basing a whole show around it's hard not to just tune out what they're talking about, because it's not important to what's happening on screen. Usually it somewhat relates to what's happening. They'll be talking about death, and then like people are dying, and yeah, there's a lot of cartoon gore, and a lot of stuff that feels like it's distracting from what they're talking about. If you really want to pay attention to what they're talking about, then what's happening on screen is just distracting. And if you really want to pay attention to what's happening on screen, then what they're talking about isn't really important to that. So I don't know. For me, like the two halves never really worked together, and it kind of felt like you're listening to a podcast while watching a cartoon. And I don't know, that to me does not work. It's like two halves of your brain not communicating with each other, because they're different. So for me, when it comes to television and movies and books for that matter, I really enjoy storytelling and like the plot of things. And so when it comes to material like this, I'm not usually that big of a fan, because the story's not that important. And yeah, for me, that's the thing I always look for. Is I look for good stories, compelling stories that are interesting, stories where I'm asking what is going to happen next. What I describe as the dramatic question. What are we as the audience always asking? What is going to happen? Or is this character going to be found out, or is something going to happen to this character? How is this turned out? Or, that sort of thing. And with this sort of material, there isn't much of a dramatic question most of the time, because even if there is like a somewhat of question, like with the story that they create around the podcast, that is not the main material of the show. The main material is the podcast. So even though you might have this sort of question in the background, it's like it's in the background because that's not what the show is about. And it, to me, it's a very experimental kind of show is how I would describe it. Yeah, and outside of those framing elements, like I said, it doesn't tell a cohesive story. Another thing I want to mention with this show is the fact that it came out yesterday, and that yesterday was April 20th. And if you're familiar with that, it means 420. And considering the sort of trippy visuals and the conversations that are kind of like deep, man. Yeah, it's that kind of show, and it kind of feels like it was designed, at least on a marketing level, for people who were inebriated. And so I kind of feel like being inebriated helped somewhat with watching this show, because being sober was kind of confusing and a lot of the stuff was bizarre. And yeah, it's not really the kind of show you watch sober. So that brings us to the question: should you watch it? My answer is no. I mean, I'm not... Obviously, you can watch it if you want to, but I wouldn't recommend this for most people. It's kind of an out there show. If this really kind of material interests you, I would say go for it, especially if you're not sober. I would say the kind of people this show is for, or if you... those like two main things, like you love Adventure Time, and specifically the parts where they get really philosophical, and you're inebriated. That's the kind that I would say that's the target audience. For the rest of people, I feel like, as bizarre as this show gets, it goes back to the idea that everything that's happening on screen isn't related to what's being talked about. There are some really bizarre and out there things that make you go, whoa, wow, what just happened? But it doesn't have to do anything with what they're talking about. They're just having a normal conversation. It's like if I were, to talk to someone and we're talking and, let's talk about politics and what's happening in the election, and, we'll have a very deep conversation about politics in general, and then we just take that and put it over footage of Adventure Time, but like on steroids with like the weirdness, because like obviously this isn't Cartoon Network, so they're really allowed to go there with some of the visuals, and it's interesting to look at. But then again, you have, I don't know, for me it doesn't work. It doesn't work that you have this kind of background conversation going on. It's like you're trying to watch a show, but then like these people right behind you are having this deep conversation. And if you're sober, to me, it doesn't work. Those are my thoughts on The Midnight Gospel. Let me know if you decide to watch the show or not. And if there's a different TV show or movie that you would like to cover on this kind of show, let me know in the comments below. Also, if you like this kind of content and you want to see more, I did do a video earlier on Mrs. America. Should you watch Mrs. America? Which maybe will be somewhere in the video here, or maybe at the end. Or I'll have to see when I'm editing it what I'm able to do. And since it's a YouTube video, I have to say it. Please like the video, if you haven't already. Please subscribe to the channel. This is a growing YouTube channel, so every subscriber matters at this point. And if you've watched to this point in the video, I figured you must at least somewhat like this content, so there's no harm in subscribing. And I guess I'll see you in the next video. Bye!